get tighter, really get behind it, tuck it inside your body. This is the tightness that you want to be in.
Get deeper as well. So you're trying to
Very
get
slow,
deeper,
slow.
deeper. And you're coming right in.
Keeping it tight is a common tip given to many newer arm wrestlers to help with their arm wrestling technique. It helps to utilize better leverage, engage more muscle activation, and have more control during the arm wrestling match. On an intuitive level, you're able to exert less force and control things less when they're far away from you. And conversely, as Devin puts it, because the more you can get tight, right, the more you're pulling to your center. What you can control out here, okay, you can control better here, you can control better here, and it's your body that you can control better than anything. As an example of what I mean by this, you can use the analogy of writing. When you hold the pen closer to the tip, you have more control over it and can apply more pressure with it. But if you try to hold it further away, then it becomes much more difficult. But I've noticed that it's sometimes quite confusing for some guys who especially don't have the best intuitive feel on the table. And this is quite understandable because there are 3 different aspects to keeping it tight. And for a beginner, coordinating movements in these 3 dimensions can be quite challenging at the start. So in this video, I want to explore what these 3 dimensions are and how they affect you on the table. Starting with probably the most common tip, keeping your arms inside your shoulders. And technically speaking, this refers to horizontal shoulder adduction. Sometimes this is phrased as keeping your elbows inside your shoulder as well, but whatever the words are used, the primary goal of this usually is as a mental cue to help prevent arm breaks. It helps by reminding the puller to not allow their shoulder to get into an overly externally rotated position, which can result in shoulder injuries or, even worse, breaks in the humerus. But other than that, it also helps as a mental cue for the activation of the pecs and subscapularis, which are the primary drivers of internal rotation. And I don't know about you guys, but from what I've seen in arm wrestling, there is a lot of internal rotation involved. Speaking of which, there has been a study done which measured the internal rotation torque at various angles of the shoulder. And it turns out, the closer the elbow was to the body, the greater the torque generation through internal rotation. Now, of course, the study didn't account for subjects being in an arm wrestling position, and it also didn't have data for elbow positions that were adducted, but I think there's still some application we can see just based on our own anecdotal experience on the table.
First of all, I want again to separate your body from arm, and I want to get your angle a little bit wider. Yeah. If you are closer, you are more effective and you are always stronger. So
next up is probably the most straightforward and the most easy one for people to execute, and that is keeping your elbow angle tight. But the reasons for this one's a little more complicated. As you can see from the graph here, the peak isometric elbow flexion strength doesn't happen until only at roughly 90 degrees. Now, you might think that starting as tight as possible also causes your opponent to have to fight through the eccentric portion of the elbow being extended, but even for eccentric force production, that usually doesn't even peak until about 130 or 140 degrees. So what gives? Well, the main reason that I can think of is more of a leverage one, and by that I'm referring to maintaining the height of your forearm. Obviously, the smaller the angle of your elbow, the higher your arm will be. As for why this is important, that's a whole nother topic by itself, but basically more height equals better leverage. The last dimension of tightness refers to how far ahead of you your elbow is. Or on the table, you can think of it as how forward or backward your elbow is on the elbow pad. Now, as a general piece of advice, we typically want our elbows to be as far back as possible for 2 main reasons. It's a mental cue for lat activation. In arm wrestling, we call this the drag. So, pulling your elbow towards yourself allows you to not only use your lats but also your rhomboids and traps to exert a huge amount of back pressure on your opponent's arm. And number 2, there is some evidence that shows that elbow flexion is also stronger at a lower shoulder flexion angle. So when your arm is out in front of you, that is what we call shoulder flexion. And the smaller that angle is, aka the closer your elbow is to your body, the greater torque can be exerted by your elbow flexors. This can be due to a variety of reasons. For example, in a previous video I talked about the force-length relationship in muscle fibers. We also know that muscle contraction force is greatly influenced by the length it is stretched or shortened. Specifically, a muscle is weakest when fully stretched or fully shortened. Basically, for all muscles, there is an ideal length that they have to exert the most amount of force. And when you shorten or lengthen the muscle, the force they can generate will be reduced.
Now, as an example, let's take a look at the muscle that most people think of when you're talking about flexing your elbow, and that is the biceps. Now, because the biceps are also a shoulder flexor, if you put your arm out ahead of you like this, that puts the bicep in a partially contracted position, which means that it can exert a lower amount of force.
On a related note, this is also why those of us who are slightly more vertically challenged should also learn to arm wrestle with a riser platform, as it allows us to keep this closer angle. But of course, as I've mentioned for this last part, it's just a general recommendation, and there are still many situations where it's beneficial to move your elbow to the front of the pad instead, such as when you're driving forward during a press or moving forward to run your opponent out of space in a defensive hook. Also, during the setup, you're kind of limited on where you can actually place your elbow by the relative length between your forearm and your opponent's forearm. So there's only so much we can do on that front.
But that being said, I hope this video has been helpful for you guys to understand a little bit more about elbow positioning on the table. Let me know how you like to set up on the table. I know I've framed most of these points as best practices, but
the code is more what you call guidelines than actual rules.
Truth be told, within arm wrestling, there is room for a lot of individual variants based on our own strengths and our own builds. So I'm curious to hear from you guys as well. I'm Greg, and I'll catch you beasts in the next one.